Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Angela Crawley.
The Prime Minister's plans for English... Sorry, question one. Not there.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will wish to join with me, indeed the whole House, in congratulating the England women's football team on reaching the semi-finals of the World Cup in Canada and wishing them well for their match against Japan this evening. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Angela Crawley.
The Prime Minister's plans for English votes for English laws will reduce my rights and the rights of other Scottish MPs in this House.
Order. The Honourable Lady must and will be heard. Angela Crawley.
The Prime Minister's plans for English votes for English laws will reduce my rights and the rights of other Scottish MPs in the House of Commons. But the real issue is my ability to protect the interests of my constituents of Lanark and Hamilton East. Will the Prime Minister guarantee today that under his plans, a bill that has a direct or indirect effect on Scotland's budget will not be certifiable as England only?
Well, first of all, let me welcome the Honourable Lady to her place. What I would say to her is we will publish our proposals shortly, and Parliament will have plenty of time to consider and vote on them. But let me be very clear, we are not creating a system of two tiers for MPs. All MPs will still vote on all bills. But what we're saying is that laws which only apply in England should only pass if they're supported by a majority of English MPs. That seems to me, in a devolved system where Scottish MSPs can determine their own future on health, on housing and on an increasing number of subjects, fairness across our United Kingdom.
Mr. Graham Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the National Audit Office called for the introduction of a fairer schools funding formula so that it, and I quote, is related more closely to pupils' needs and less affected by where they live. Now, can the Prime Minister confirm today from the dispatch box that the additional and very welcome £390 million awarded last year as a first step towards a fairer funding system will be incorporated into the baseline for future years?
Well, I can say that we will implement the pledges in our manifesto on this issue because we do need to make funding fairer across the country. And if you look at the figures today, it is clearly unfair that a school in one part of the country can receive over 50% more funding than an identical school in another part of the country. So we've already made some progress on this, but I want us to go further.
Harriet Harman.
Can I join the Prime Minister in his congratulations to England's women's football team with only a fraction of the resources the men get? They are showing the men how it's done. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, we now know that 22 British citizens have been confirmed dead in the Tunisia attack. Our thoughts are with the bereaved and injured and the help they and their families will need. The bereaved and those who've experienced life-changing injuries and trauma will need long-term practical and emotional support. The experience after 7/7 was that to really help those affected families, there needs to be coordination across departments and agencies. So will he establish a dedicated task force reporting to a minister to support those who've suffered in this terrible attack?
Well, yes, I can give the Right Honourable Lady that assurance. Let me update the House, because I'm sad to say that the confirmed number of British citizens killed in this appalling attack is now 27, and as we've said, we do expect it to rise still further. Today we're repatriating 8 bodies from Tunisia on an RAF C-17 plane. That plane is now in the air and it will land at RAF Brize Norton this afternoon. Every family of a victim now has a dedicated Foreign Office liaison officer, but I can confirm what she asked, and I've asked the Cabinet Secretary for advice on creating a ministerial committee to ensure that work is properly coordinated right across government to provide all the support that the victims of this appalling attack deserve, and also to make sure that as a nation we mark and commemorate this event appropriately.
Harriet Harman.
Well, I think that's a really important step that he's taken, and we fully support it and thank those who are going to be working in that respect. Reports in the last few days suggest that it wasn't just a lone gunman, but an organised cell. Following the Home Secretary's visit to Tunisia and the deployment of 50 British police officers, can he update the House on the progress being made to help identify the perpetrators and bring them to justice?
Well, on this specific issue, there's still a lot of work to be done to identify all of the circumstances of this appalling attack and the support that this gunman received. As we get that information, as we can confirm that information, I will make sure the House is regularly updated. In terms of the discussions between my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, and the Tunisians, I can confirm that they went ahead and were successful. This is looking, as I said previously, at everything from the protective security in hotels and resorts all the way through to intelligence cooperation at the highest levels between Britain and Tunisia, so we can help with their capacity to combat appalling events like this. It is going to need a lot of long-term work between our two countries, but we also have the French and the Germans and the Americans also willing to help, and we need to coordinate between ourselves how best to support this country on its road to democracy.
Harriet Harman.
The Prime Minister has rightly said that this was an attack on our values and everything we stand for, and there is radicalisation in this country too. Last November, the Intelligence and Security Committee said that the PREVENT programme hadn't been given sufficient priority and that counter-radicalisation programmes are not working. Today, a new statutory duty to challenge radicalisation comes into effect. Will there be sufficient training and support for those covered by the duty? And will he look again at the concern that the PREVENT programme hasn't sufficiently focused on engaging with the communities?
Well, I think the right honourable lady raises very important issues, and let me answer them as directly as I can. First of all, in terms of PREVENT, we have now put more money and resources into that programme. Her second point about the statutory duty on public sector bodies, I think this is very important because we're saying to schools and universities and local authorities and others, they have a duty to deal with radicalisation and confront extremism, because this is an effort that is not just for the police and the security services or indeed just for the government, it is an effort for us all. In terms of her specific question, which goes back to whether it was right to split the PREVENT work into work that's done to deal with extremism under the aegis of the Home Office, and then programmes to encourage integration, which should be done by the Department of Communities and Local Government, I maintain that was the right decision. It followed a review by Alec Carlisle in 2011, who found, and I quote, "There have been cases where groups who we would now consider to support an extremist ideology have received funding." It's very important, as we discussed in this House on Monday, that that doesn't happen. Yes, we should work with community groups, but not those that encourage an extremist narrative.
Harriet Harman.
Well, I think that it's important that the Prime Minister doesn't just defend the decisions he's made, but continues to reflect on this and really tries to make absolutely sure that he gets it right. And if he does that, and the right outcomes there, then we will strongly, strongly support him on that. With all-party support, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, if I can turn to another issue, with all-party support, the Prime Minister commissioned the Davis report to look at the question of airport capacity. Now that the Commission has recommended a third runway at Heathrow, does he agree with us that, subject to key environmental tests being met, there should be no further delay and they should go ahead? Is he going to take that forward now?
Well, first of all, let us all thank Howard Davis and the team for the very thorough piece of work they have done. I think there's a lot of common ground across all sides of the House, or almost all sides of the House, that there is the need for additional airport capacity in the southeast of England, not least to maintain this country's competitiveness. But it is important now that there's a very detailed report that we study it. And I'm very clear about the legal position that if we say anything now before studying the report, actually you could endanger whatever decision is made. But the guarantee I can give to the Honourable Lady is that a decision will be made by the end of the year.
Harriet Harman.
Well, he says there is common ground, and there is common ground across the House. The worry is the lack of common ground on his side of the House. And he says there'll be... He gives the impression there's going to be a proper process, but there's something very different coming out of Number 10, because their briefing, it's not going to happen. It looks like the Prime Minister has been overruled by the member for Uxbridge, and he should tell him he's not the leader of the Tory party yet. He should tell him that. So can I ask the Prime Minister, will he stand up for Britain's interests, or will he just be bullied by Boris?
I would have thought, with all her years of experience, the Right Honourable Lady would know not to believe everything that she reads in her morning's newspapers. It would probably be good for her blood pressure as well as good for mine if she didn't. But let me give the mildest warnings of jumping to a conclusion before seeing the results, because we had a classic example of it last week when the Shadow Health Secretary warned the government that the poverty figures would make us all hang our heads in shame. That was, of course, before the poverty figures were published, showing that relative poverty was at its lowest level since the 1980s.
He seems to be keen to get off the issue of airports. It seems like he's in a holding pattern above Heathrow, and that Boris won't let him land. Mr. Speaker, our economic infrastructure is essential for future jobs, for growth and our productivity. But this week we've seen the government pull the plug on electrification of the railways and seriously undermine the renewable energy sector. And now they're backing off over airports and risking losing the opportunity of Britain being at the heart of the global economy. If he makes a swift decision on the Davis report, we will support him, and there will be a majority in the House. So will he put Britain's national interests first?
Well, first of all, it's an interesting day when the leader of the Conservative Party wants to talk about child poverty and the leader of the opposition wants to talk about an airport report that none of us have yet had time to read. What I can... And I seem to remember that the last leader of the Labour Party, although we've been churning through a few recently, had a totally different position on airports to the one that she is now putting forward. What I can say to the Honourable Lady is we will all read this report and a decision will be made by the end of the year.
Mr. Simon Hoare.
Speaker, Mr. Speaker, my constituents in rural North Dorset look increasingly to superfast broadband to help in education, agriculture and in business. Will he commit the government to do all that it can with the sufficient energy and resources to ensure that the 5% black hole is filled as quickly as possible?
First of all, let me welcome my honourable friend to his seat. Before coming here, he was a very successful district councillor in an area I'm familiar with, where he helped to achieve the second lowest council tax in the country, and I'm sure he'll bring that sense of good housekeeping to this place. He's absolutely right to raise the issue of superfast broadband and how we fill in the last 5 and 10% of homes, particularly in rural areas. We are providing extra funding and we're looking at all the different sorts of technology that can help to deliver this.
Sir Angus Robertson.
Mr. Speaker, I associate myself and the Scottish National Party with all the tributes and condolences to the families and friends of everybody caught up with the tragedy in Tunisia. Mr. Speaker, because of the way the United Kingdom is structured, decisions on health, on education, and much English legislation has an impact on the Scottish budget. Will the Prime Minister confirm that he plans to exclude Scottish MPs from parts of the democratic process at Westminster that will have an impact on Scotland?
The point I would make to the honourable gentleman is that English MPs are entirely excluded from any discussion of Scottish health or Scottish housing or Scottish education. What we are proposing is actually a very measured and sensible step, which says that when there is a bill that only affects, for instance, England, the committee stage should be of English MPs, but then the whole House will vote at report stage and indeed at third reading stage. What this is going to introduce, as it were, is a system for making sure that the wishes of English MPs cannot be overruled. That, I think, is only fair in a system when the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Parliament and indeed the Northern Irish Parliament have increased powers.
Angus Robertson.
Mr. Speaker, on overruling MPs, it's very interesting, Mr. Speaker, because on the Scotland Bill, 58 of 59 Scottish MPs have voted for that legislation to be strengthened, and they've been outvoted by English. Not content with outvoting Scottish MPs elected on a mandate to strengthen the Scotland Bill, he is now going to introduce second-class status for us as MPs elected from Scotland on issues which can impact on the Scottish budget. He's even planning to make the membership of the Scottish Affairs Select Committee a minority pursuit for Scottish MPs. Is this what the Prime Minister means when he says there's a respect agenda?
I'll tell you what I mean by a respect agenda, which is every single thing Lord Smith represented in terms of welfare has gone into the bill. And isn't it interesting that he objects to a vote in the UK Parliament on a UK issue, which is what has happened? But let me say this to him again. Instead of endlessly talking about the process, isn't it time that the SNP started to talk about how they're going to use these powers? Why don't you start telling us which welfare benefits do you want to put up? Which taxes do you want to increase? Why don't you start to tell us? And I've been following this debate very closely. I notice, Mr. Speaker, none of Scotland's 59 MPs are arguing that the state pension should be devolved. In other words, the principle of pooling and sharing our resources and risks across the United Kingdom, which I believe in as leader of the United Kingdom, is apparently shared by the Scottish National Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Paul Short from Wooler, showed great courage during the Tunisian massacre last week by helping save the life of an injured victim with first aid skills he'd learned as a member of the Territorial Army. Can the Prime Minister set out how the new measures in the extremism bill will tackle extremists and stand up for our values of democracy, equality, free speech and respect for minorities?
Well, first of all, let me take the opportunity of praising her constituent and the skills that were used on that dreadful day in Tunisia. What our bill will do is reinforce the work we've already done to increase funding into counter-terrorism and counter-terrorism policing, to make sure we have this duty on public authorities to combat radicalisation, but then to go after this issue of the fact that there are groups and individuals who are very clever at endorsing extremism but stopping one step short of actually condoning terrorism. And that's what these new banning orders that we're looking at are aimed to achieve, because we are clear that people that support the extremist narrative, they've got no place in our public debate.
Mark Durkan.
Given regional wage profiles, many families in the north of Ireland will identify with the concerns from the 4 Children's Commissioners today on tax credits. Further to heeding those wider warnings, will the Prime Minister have the Chancellor take particular care to ensure that no supposedly more targeted changes to child benefit or tax credits will end up being misdirected against natural, everyday, cross-border working families in my constituency and its hinterland?
Well, first of all, let me say to the Honourable Gentleman, when we talk about cross-border working families, it is still the case that welfare arrangements in the United Kingdom are far more generous than what is available in the Republic of Ireland. But look, our view is clear. The right answer is to create jobs, to cut taxes, to raise living standards and to reduce welfare. I want an economy that is high pay, low taxes and low welfare, instead of low pay, high taxes and high welfare. And let me just share with the House one statistic which I think is important. Under the last government, under the last Labour government, the number of working... I know you don't want to talk about the last Labour government. Right. Well, under the last government, inequality fell. Child poverty fell. Now for the history lesson. Let's go back to the last Labour government. Under Labour, the number of working-age people in in-work poverty rose by around 20%. Now, that was at the same time that welfare spending on people in work went up from £6 billion to £28 billion. What this shows is the Labour model of taking money off people in tax, recycling it back to them in tax credits, hasn't worked. It's time for a new approach of creating jobs, cutting taxes, and having businesses that are creating the livelihoods we need.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having led a campaign and authored a letter signed by over 120 members of Parliament from across the House to the Prime Minister and to the BBC not to call the so-called Islamic State ISIL or ISIS, I thank the Prime Minister for not calling it an Islamic State, but the issue remains by calling it ISIL. Can the Prime Minister lead the way by officially calling it Daesh, as do France, Turkey and other countries of the Middle East, and which is acceptable to Muslims in this country and around the world?
I think my honourable friend who's spoken about this a lot makes a very strong point. The argument I would make is that Islamic State is inappropriate because this is neither Islamic in the true meaning of the word, nor indeed is a state. It is a bunch of terrorist thugs. So I'm happy for people to use Daesh. I think ISIL is an alternative because it doesn't confer such authority. And I'm pleased that the BBC seem to have moved their position because until yesterday they were calling it Islamic State, and it looks like they're going to change their approach, and I really welcome that.
Nigel Dodds. Speaker, given the importance, the vital importance of Parliament and members on all sides of the House and from all parts of the United Kingdom being able to hold properly and effectively the government of the day to account, can the Prime Minister confirm whether he intends to try to reduce the size of the next House of Commons to 600 members?
I'm committed to what is in the Conservative manifesto, which is to complete the work that should have been done in the last Parliament so that we have equal-sized constituencies in a smaller House of Commons and cut the cost of politics.
Andrew Bridgen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Due to ongoing issues around the Post Office's Horizon software accounting system, I believe that many honest, decent, hard-working sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses have lost their reputations, their livelihoods, their savings, and in the worst cases, their liberty. This is a national disgrace, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend consider the requests from members across this House for a judicial inquiry into this matter and bring it to a conclusion?
My right honourable friend, I think, has done a real service in campaigning tirelessly on this issue, and I know that he has led a debate in the House on it as well. The Post Office's answer is to say that they set up this independent inquiry, which hasn't found evidence of wrongdoing, but clearly this has not satisfied many members on all sides of the House who've seen individual constituency cases and want to find better answers. So what I think needs to happen next is for my right honourable friend, the Permanent Under-Secretary at the Business Department, is going to convene a meeting involving members of this House, the Post Office, representatives of sub-postmasters, to discuss their concerns and see what should happen next. I would hope it wouldn't be necessary to have a full independent judicial inquiry to get to the bottom of this issue, but get to the bottom of the issue we must.
Question 5, closed question, Mr Graham Allen.
Number 5, Mr. Speaker.
I regularly reflect on Prime Minister's questions with Cabinet colleagues and others. For all its faults, and there are many, I would say that it has two important points. First of all, it puts the Prime Minister on the spot to the public, but it also, I would say, puts the government on the spot to the Prime Minister, as it's an important mechanism of accountability, needing to know issues from right across every department before coming to the House at 12 o'clock on a Wednesday.
Mr Graham Allen.
Given that Parliament may be moving out of this place in 2020, would the Prime Minister take this opportunity to share the joys of Prime Minister's questions that he's just outlined and this federal Parliament by convening it in each of the nations of the United Kingdom and thereby symbolise his government and this Parliament's commitment to both the Union and to devolution?
Well, as I've said in an earlier answer, I'm committed to trying to cut the cost of politics, and I'm not sure that would help. I think it is important that we take our politics and issues to all the different regions of the country, and that is something the government is very committed to do, not least with our regional economic plans for every region of our country. As for the future of this House of Commons and where we stand and where we debate, that is a matter for the House of Commons, but I have to say I have a slight emotional attachment to this place, this one specifically.
Mr Richard Benyon.
The brass fittings on that dispatch box are worn paper thin by the sweat on the palms of Prime Ministers and Ministers down the ages, and it is a visual example of parliamentary accountability. And while our constituents rightly feel that at times this session is a little absurd, does my right honourable friend agree that it would be a great pity if senior members of the executive were not held to account in that way?
I agree with my honourable friend. I remember taking some constituents on a tour when I first became a Member of Parliament and hearing for the first time something I hadn't known, which is, of course, when this chamber was bombed, some of the most important speeches and parliamentary occasions of Winston Churchill actually took place in the other place rather than here. But I don't want to start a complete fight between both houses, so I think I'll leave it at that.
Neil Gray!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has now been asked repeatedly about his plans to exclude Scottish MPs from decisions that will directly and indirectly impact on Scotland's budget and my constituents in Airdrie and Shotts. Will he finally tell this House and the people of Scotland whether it is right to create a second-class status for Scottish MPs through the back door, or is he content to press ahead with plans that will bring about the breakup of Britain?
Prime Minister!
I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I'm quite baffled. I thought the whole point of the SNP is they wanted to exclude themselves from the UK Parliament forever. I thought that was the whole point. But actually what we're putting in place is a fair and balanced system that is fair to all parts of our United Kingdom, and long may it stay together.
Edward Arger!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the past 5 years, increasing numbers of people in the East Midlands and across the UK have been deciding to take the courageous and important step of setting up their own businesses and becoming self-employed. What steps will the Prime Minister and the Government take in the future to further support these entrepreneurs in my constituency and beyond, who represent and personify aspiration and hard work?
First of all, let me welcome my honourable friend to his place and agree with him that actually people taking that step to become self-employed, to start up their own business, has been a very big part of the jobs and enterprise revolution that we've seen in our country over the last 5 years. Things like start-up loans have made a real difference, and that's why we're increasing them in this Parliament. But I do think it's important when we look at helping self-employed people to look at all the aspects of being self-employed, how you interact with pensions and benefits and maternity leave and public authorities and rules around social housing. And that's why I'm asking Julie Dean, the founder of the fantastic Cambridge Satchel Company and a model for how self-employed people can achieve great things, to lead a review for the government. Let's look at all the ways in which we can help self-employed people get going.
Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the Prime Minister's commitment to localism, will he stand by and respect the decision made by Lancashire County Council this week, rejecting fracking? Yes or no?
Well, these are decisions that must be made by local authorities in the proper way under the planning regime that we have. Personally, I hope that over time there will be unconventional gas sites that will go ahead, whether in Lancashire or elsewhere, because I want to see our country exploit all the natural resources that we have. I want us to keep energy bills down. I want us to be part of this revolution that can create thousands of jobs. And I also want to make sure that where we can exploit our own gas reserves, rather than ship gas from the other side of the world, which actually has a higher carbon footprint, that we should do that as well. But if the Labour Party wants to paint itself into a background of not wanting any unconventional gas at all, I think they should say so.
Look, Sharma!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Labour-controlled Reading Borough Council recently received a damning report from Ofsted for not doing enough to help struggling schools under their control. Can the Prime Minister tell us what the government intends to do to make sure that systemically failing LEAs like Reading do not continue to ruin the life chances of our young people?
Well, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this because, frankly, one extra term in a failing school is too long for our children. And I think in the past, governments and LEAs have been too tolerant of allowing schools to continue to fail year after year. So this government has set very testing regime for failing schools, for those that are inadequate, and also, as my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, set out this week, we're going to do similar things to schools that we define as coasting, that could be doing better. Because, frankly, you can now see the model of where an academy chain takes over a failing school, changes some of the leadership, puts in place the things that are necessary. You can see radical increases in the results. And that is what we want. Today, we are talking about how we tackle poverty in the long term, and tackling sink schools and educational underachievement is vital to the life chances of our children.
Mr. Speaker, can I strongly urge the Prime Minister that after 4 opportunities he still hasn't answered the question regarding the impact of English votes for English laws? Can the Prime Minister finally reassure the people of my constituency that an elected MP will not be given minority status in matters that will affect the Scottish budget and consequently the lives of the citizens of Dundee? And moreover, last night 50 out of 59 Scottish MPs...
We're very grateful because we have got the gist of it, honestly. The Honourable Gentleman, Prime Minister.
What I say to the Honourable Gentleman is he has had a very clear answer. Maybe the SNP don't like this answer, but the proposals that we discussed at great length in the last Parliament for solving this issue will now be introduced. And the absolutely key point I would make is that if in some future Parliament there's disagreement between English MPs who want one thing and the House of Commons as a whole that wants another thing, there would have to be a way of resolving this deadlock. This is effectively a block for English MPs. It is not the ability to legislate willy-nilly, and he should know that if he reads the manifesto.
Jack Presti!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister feel comfortable that a Conservative government has implemented a spending target on foreign aid, but will not commit to a target of a minimum of 2% of GDP on defence? And does he realise that this is damaging the relationship with our key strategic ally, the United States, and risking our credibility with our NATO allies?
What I say to my honourable friend, who I know cares deeply about this issue and also has in his constituency some of the most important defence manufacturers in our country, is that we have in every year met that 2% target. And that's in a European Union where many countries don't even meet a 1% amount for investing in defence. The commitment we've made already is to invest £160 billion across 10 years into our equipment programme with real terms increases every year. And that is why we can say the aircraft carriers, the C-17s, the new aeroplanes, all will be coming forward. We will obviously make final spending decisions in the spending review this autumn.
Mr. Dennis Skinner.
For a man who seemingly is never away from Europe, why is it that he's never took the opportunity when he's been there to put in a claim for state aid to save British miners' jobs? He's the man who, during the election campaign, masqueraded as the workers' champion, and he hasn't got the guts to help those miners. He took £700 million out of the mine workers' pension scheme, and he's not given a penny back. No wonder they call him Dodgy Dave, the man that went to Eton, educated beyond his intelligence.
Well, it's very good to see the Labour Party in full voice cheering on Jurassic Park. I would stick to the movie. But there's a serious point here. This government has offered £20 million to the owners of Hatfield Colliery to keep that colliery going. So we have been prepared to put forward money, and unlike the last government, we've been prepared to make ministerial directions because we've got some courage when it comes to these things.
Goldsmith!
Mr. Speaker.
Oh, the House must hear Mr. Goldsmith.
Mr. Speaker,
There is a very strong sense that the Airports Commission began life 3 years or so ago with a conclusion and then spent £20 million backing up that conclusion. The Prime Minister is going to have to make a decision on the back of these recommendations shortly, but what assurances can he give the million or so Londoners who stand to be affected by Heathrow expansion that he will engage with the real arguments in a way that Sir Howard Davis has not?
Well, let me pay tribute to the honourable gentleman for how strongly he campaigns on this issue. I know how strongly he cares about it and how strongly his constituents feel about it. The promise I can give him that this very thorough report that landed on my desk yesterday afternoon is going to get properly studied, because this really does matter. If you make some precipitate decision or rule out one particular option, you will actually make the decision you would like to make impossible to achieve because of judicial review. We may not like that in this House, but those are the facts, and those are the ones we need to operate on.
Last but not least, Clive Lewis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The North and Suffolk NHS Mental Health Trust, which serves my constituency, is refusing to publish the so-called Alexander report into its operations. The report, which I've seen, raises serious questions about patient safety and care due to cuts to services. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the duty of candour should apply equally to NHS management as it does to NHS frontline staff? And if so, would he join me to call for its publication?
Prime Minister. Well, first of all, let me welcome the honourable gentleman to this House. I make no apology for the CQC's rigorous inspection regime, which is identifying areas that need improvement. I would argue the two things we need here is to uncover bad practice and turn it round, but then to back that up with the resources that the NHS needs, including those recommended by the Stevens Plan. And as things stand, it's only this party that's backing that extra £8 billion into the NHS and not the party opposite.